Ireland in Revolution, Yeats in 1916, Walter Benjamin's Critique of Violence. In this lecture, I'm going to be trying to give you a guide to Benjamin's critique of violence in order to try and frame the issue of revolutionary violence in Ireland in the run-up to what was known as the 1916 Rising. I put a number of links to recommended documentaries on Brightspace for you, and there is by now an immense amount of documentary material easily available and compelling to watch, which will help you to figure out something of the events of 1916 themselves. In recent years, the usual story of male heroism has been supplemented by a feminist critique of the biases of that historiography, and they have restored women to their central role in the Irish Revolution. As well as this, there has been a tendency to ignore the working classes and their contribution to 1916 as a function of the middle class nature of Irish historiography after independence. And that omission too has been made good, though arguably to a lesser extent than the feminist critique. But there have been both feminist and socialist critiques of the historiography of 1916. And I would advise you to be mindful of that when you're seeking materials to apprise you of what exactly happened. In this video, then, I'm not going to talk in any detail at all about what happened in 1916. I'm going to try and frame the problem of violence, building on our analysis of violence and the foundation of the state in the lecture that I gave you on Unbiased Strand. Benjamin's article is complicated and obscure, and I'm not expecting you to understand or care about all of it. I just want to use it, and believe me, you can read it many times and still be defeated by aspects of it. Slavoj Žižek, who we read in Violence and the Foundation of the State, himself gives very qualified commentary on Benjamin, suggesting that he himself is not clear of the details. However, there are certain things about it that are so valuable that I think it's worth staying with in order to recover those distinctions. In the Critique of Violence, Benjamin starts by saying that the task of a critique of violence can be summarized as that of expounding its relation to law and justice. The idea being that violence a cause, he says, only becomes violent when it enters into moral relations. And moral relations are defined by the concepts of law and justice. So the problem then isn't just violence, it's violence and its relationship to morality. When is it okay to be violent? Can violence ever be good, for example? These are the kinds of questions he's addressing himself to. Whether violence in a given case is a means to a just or an unjust end. And he suggests that most theorizing about violence tends to focus on this question of ends and means. Whether violence as a principle could be a moral means even to just ends. This is a more profound question for Benjamin than the question of when violence can be good or not. The question is, can violence ever be good? Is violence ever justifiable? And he's dubious of the entire tradition of distinguishing violence based on means and ends. John O'Leary, Yeats's Fenian hero, says in a citation quoted in Elman, Yeats, The Man in the Masks, that there are certain things that a man must not do to save a nation. O'Leary, in other words, did not condone terrorism, so-called, in the name of the nation or in the name of Republican founding. In other words, he was not an advocate of revolutionary violence. He was a Fenian who believed that the task of Fenianism was to prepare the Irish people for the business of wresting freedom from the English by political means. And terrorism was not legitimate violence in O'Leary's view. Clearly, in the 1916 Rising, there were many who did not share O'Leary's view. So, how did they justify their decision to rebel violently against the crown? How did they justify in their minds the deaths that would ensue? Bearing in mind, as it happened, that the majority of deaths in the 1916 Rising, as in many wars, were civilian. Benjamin suggests that a usual critique of violence focuses either on natural law or positive law. In natural law, violence is taken, he says, as a natural datum. In other words, violence is an inherent aspect of nature. Nature is red in tooth and claw. And against this, he situates positive law, which does not focus on law as natural, but rather on violence as a product of history. We've seen this before in relation to the question of legitimate and illegitimate violence. Foucault's analysis of violence and the foundation of the state. Natural law, Benjamin links to the natural law theory of the state, and here he's talking about people like Hobbes, who we've discussed briefly. You recall Hobbes's Leviathan suggested that the sovereign or king was justified in their assertion of a monopoly on violence because before the sovereign state is founded, humans exist in a kind of state of nature or a war of all against all, in which violence is endemic, uncontrolled, and uncontrollable. And he made the rather ingenious argument that people gave up their right to violence on their own behalf, that people give up all their violence for the sake of the state, as Benjamin puts it. So we know this argument, and it suggests that violence is justified only when the sovereign wields it in order to protect people within the contract that they have signed with the sovereign from the possibility of a kind of generalized violence. Benjamin makes the point that social contract theory, which makes it sound like an agreement, a contract, is in fact rooted in violence, that a totally non-violent resolution of conflicts can never lead to a legal contract, for the simple reason, he says, that anyone who breaks the contract lays themselves open again to the threat of legitimate violence. So the question is not one of whether violence is okay or not, it's whether violence is legitimate or not. That violence is inherent, he says, to the resolution of conflict between man and man. So positive law is less interested in natural violence and more interested in the question of legitimate and illegitimate violence, that it judges all evolving law only in criticizing its means. Benjamin's style is dense and intense in this lecture. There's a lot of very condensed statements, so we're going to try and unpick a few of them. But when he speaks about positive laws being interested in sanctioned and unsanctioned force, he's talking about the same distinction between legitimate and illegitimate violence. Violence that's okay, justified, even necessary, versus violence that's not okay, unjustified, and necessary to quash. If justice is the criterion of ends, he says, legality is that of means. What does he mean here? What does it mean, he says, when just ends can be attained by justified means, or justified means used for just ends? Benjamin sees this whole notion of ends and means, the cliche that the ends justify the means, as dubious, as he calls it, bottomless casuistry, basically falsehood. It's a confidence trick based on what we've seen as the arbitrariness of the monopoly on violence asserted and then legitimated through a law-preserving violence. In other words, the notion is that there are two kinds of law, natural law and positive law, and they both try to justify violence differently. The natural law tradition justifies violence on the basis that sovereign violence is better than generalized violence. And positive law tries to justify violence on the basis that legitimate violence is acceptable and illegitimate violence is not. In other words, there can be nothing that legitimate violence can do wrong, and there is nothing that illegitimate violence can do that's right. But he asks the question, what light is thrown on the nature of violence by the fact that such criteria can be applied at all? What do we learn about violence from the fact that there is such a thing as legitimate or illegitimate violence? He makes the point that Foucault made in the lecture that we read for Violence and the Foundation of the State, that positive law, that's the law that is interested in legitimate versus illegitimate violence, demands of all violence a proof of its historical origin, which under certain conditions is declared legal or sanctioned. That there is a presence or absence of a general historical acknowledgement of its ends. Now, we've seen this with Foucault previously. Foucault, who said that the power relations that function in a society like ours are essentially anchored in a certain relationship of force that was established in and through war at a given historical moment that can be historically specified. And it's this given historical moment, Benjamin suggests, that is used to legitimate certain acts of violence. In the colonial context, and maybe we should just drop down into a historical example. In a colonial context, this whole question of sovereign violence and legitimacy is, of course, refracted through an extra layer of complexity. It's not just, for example, that the English sovereign is entitled to levy violence against English citizens because he or she has taken unto themselves a monopoly on violence on behalf of those very citizens to protect them from themselves in the state of nature that they would relapse into if the sovereign were deposed. Fair enough, you might say. But does this give the English king the right to levy violence against the Irish? Colonialism, in other words, is an ongoing crisis of legitimate violence. And it's one where the arbitrariness of the foundations of the basis for the legitimacy of violence are laid bare by the simple fact that the subject people of a colony do not recognize the sovereign of the invading nation as legitimate. So the whole question of legitimate and illegitimate violence was a very pressing one in Ireland, where English rule was seen as illegitimate by a republican tradition that then was sought to justify its own recourse to violence on the basis that illegitimate violence was actually the prerogative of the English in this case. That yes, there is such a thing as illegitimate violence, and it's called colonialism. So the colonialism and the anti-colonial struggle really queered the pitch of anyone who wanted to suggest that positive law could tell us what violence was right or wrong based on its legitimacy. Because, as the Irish were never tired of pointing out, English occupation in Ireland was not deemed legitimate. It's precisely because of these sticky questions in the Irish context that somebody like Yeats is obliged to obscure history and to seek to transcend it. You remember, for example, in Upon a House Shaken by the Land agitation, the moment when he claimed that the Anglo-Irish, where passion and precision have been won, time out of mind. You see here where he tries to claim that the Anglo-Irish have been in Ireland for so long that we can't even remember when they got here, as if English invasions had somehow slipped the Irish mind. Well, of course, the Anglo-Irish had not been here since time out of mind. Their arrival was very keenly remembered and documented in various ballads and stories and songs and later histories of the arrival of the English into Ireland. But Yeats is trying again to get us to transcend the messy spaces of history. He wants us to occupy a more transcendental realm where such differences disappear and people like himself come into focus as the natural leaders of the Irish, an inherently conservative argument. So, colonialism, all of this to say, complicates any reckoning with the question of violence and its legitimacy or not. Benjamin then sums up his whole early exposition of natural law and positive law by saying that natural law attempts, by the justness of the ends, to justify the means. In other words, if the thing you're doing is justified in being done, then the means to do it are also justified. Positive law tries to guarantee the justness of the ends through the justification of the means. In other words, if what you're doing is justified, no outcome of that justified action can itself be unjustified. This is a way, in other words, of grounding legal actions of the state. If the state has a monopoly on violence, it is justified in using violence to maintain its grip on the monopoly of violence on behalf of the state. And since the state is its own end, the maintenance of the state justifies the means of violence that underpin it. You can see how Benjamin is occupying these questions because he's trying to torque the issue of legitimacy. The problem that Foucault pointed out, and that Benjamin is also interested to point out, is that in the natural law tradition, but also in the positive law tradition, we arrive at the same problem, that might is right, that violence is self-legitimating, that force forces us to accept itself as legitimate for as long as it can maintain its ability to force us to accept it as legitimate. And this is why Benjamin concedes the point, which was the Hobbesian point, that all right historically was the prerogative of kings or nobles, in short of the mighty. You often hear neocons, neoconservatives today saying that history is written by the victors. And so there is no need to consider the position of the weak. They will be rendered irrelevant and invisible in their defeat. So that we're back to Max Weber's famous definition of a state as a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. And to the extent that the state claims and maintains that monopoly, it both legitimates itself and the violence used to maintain it. This is the beauty of the state as a kind of circular ontology. So that this is why Benjamin rejects or seeks to move beyond the positive law and natural law traditions. From the point of view of violence, which alone can guarantee law, he says there is no equality, but at the most equally great violence. And he says that in fact, what these things have in common is that violence, crowned by fate, is the origin of law. It's the arbitrariness of fate, by which he means here something like the radical contingency of circumstance, that grounds law. And this is not much to legitimate law or violence. If law is legitimated by violence and violence founds the basis for the legitimation of law, then law is itself an agent of violence. So that he suggests that the distinction between violence used for just ends and violence used for unjust ends must be emphatically rejected. There's nothing at stake here except the principle that might is right. We are not obliged, in other words, to obey the law to the extent that we consider it to have been imposed by violence. Yet, He doesn't want to descend into what he calls childish anarchism, bearing in mind that the task of a critique of violence can be summarized as that of expounding its relation to law and justice. He says that if we were to lapse into the idea of what pleases is permitted, a kind of, I want to say, Nietzschean ecstasy of violence, but a kind of anarchism, he calls it, a childish anarchism. He warns us that such a maxim merely excludes reflection on the moral and historical spheres, and thereby on any meaning in action, and beyond this, on any meaning in reality itself. Nietzsche, in one of his works, says, "There are no moral phenomena, there are only moral interpretations of phenomena." For Benjamin, we must remain within the sphere of law and justice because that is where morality is created. And without morality, Benjamin suggests, there is no basis for meaning in action or meaning in reality. In other words, we're back to a kind of horrific state of nature. So that all attacks that are made in the name of a formless freedom, without being able to specify this higher order of freedom, remain impotent against it. Here you might think of libertarianism and the notion of freedom as a kind of absolute that doesn't have any specific content to ground it. There's a danger in that for Benjamin. So he's querying the legitimacy of positive law and querying the justification of the social contract theory on the basis that it too is founded in violence and is a circular argument. But that doesn't mean that he's looking to sanction amoral anarchism. He wants to find a new basis for new distinctions. So he brings us to this idea of law-making violence and law-preserving violence. And here again, there's a kind of circular ontology. Law-making violence, he says, is required to prove its worth in victory. So victory legitimates the violence used to achieve it. However, this law-making violence also necessitates further violence to sustain it. And this leads to the necessity for law-preserving violence. So he says the function of violence in lawmaking is twofold, in the sense that lawmaking pursues as its end, with violence as the means, what is to be established as law. But at this very moment of lawmaking, it specifically establishes as law not an end unalloyed by violence, but one necessarily and intimately bound to it under the title of power. So that lawmaking is about power. And this is again an analysis that's taken up by Foucault in the essay that we read from last week. All violence, Benjamin says, as a means is either lawmaking or law preserving, and that power is what is guaranteed by all lawmaking violence. And this is where we get back to the notion of Weber's monopoly. Once the legal system has been legitimated by a founding act of violence, it then tries to assert this monopoly. It tries to erect, in all areas where individual ends could be usefully pursued by violence, legal ends that can be realized only by legal power, so that violence becomes the sole prerogative of the state. It's a version of the Hobbesian contract on the basis that the state says, we are going to wield a monopoly of violence on your behalf in order to secure you from each other. And the great agent of this, of course, and Benjamin is unstinting in his criticism of them, is the police. Lawmaking is power making, assumption of power, and to that extent, an immediate manifestation of violence. So you see how everywhere that Benjamin goes, looking for somewhere to ground violence, he just finds legitimate violence grounded by itself. And this is why he suggests that law sees violence in the hands of individuals as a danger undermining the legal system. Benjamin is from the Marxist tradition, And so he's interested in class struggle, and that's why he gives the example of the strike. That what makes violence among citizens nervous is that it has the propensity to change and modify the law. In other words, it's law-making violence, the very kind of violence that the state wants to assert a monopoly on. So that the strike is an interesting example for him, precisely because of its power to found and modify legal conditions. That the state fears this violence of the strike for its law-making character. He suggests that the only reason why workers are allowed to strike in any form at all is because there's a deeper fear that the state holds of reactive violence. So it grants the right to strike on the basis that it forestalls violent actions the state is afraid to oppose. It allows you a certain amount of, again, legitimately seeded violence in order to offset the appeal to a greater illegitimate violence that might lead to the overthrow of the state. This is Marxist analysis, the idea that the workers are granted rights in order to placate and to obviate their revolutionary potential. So we have then law-making violence and the agents that must preserve the law. This is violence's law-preserving function. And this is where, for Benjamin, the rottenness at the heart of the legal system becomes apparent. Law-preserving violence, he suggests, is distinguished from law-making violence because it may not set itself new ends. It's only a means to the preservation of the existing system. Revolutionary violence, the violence of the workers' strike, is precisely setting itself new ends, including the overthrow of the state. The police cannot operate to overthrow the state. They operate rather to preserve it. They function, as he says, to effect the subordination of citizens to laws. And this is the essence of law-preserving violence. On the issue of the death sentence or capital punishment, or shootings on the street, or the extraordinary incidents of violence against racialized subjects in the United States, for example, we see for Benjamin how it is in the exercise of violence over life and death, more than in any other legal act, that the law reaffirms itself. And here again, Hobbes would agree that you know that the sovereign is sovereign precisely because of his recourse to sovereign violence. But you know that sovereign violence is his prerogative because he is the sovereign. We're back in the ontologies of the circle, the self-perpetuating legality of legitimate violence. But the spectacle of capital punishment, the death sentence, which is why conservatives always want it back, is precisely because it's a spectacle which shows everyone who's boss. In the police, however, for Benjamin, the law-making and law-preserving violence merges in a murky kind of shadow economy of the state. And the police are always allowed to rampage all the more blindly in the most vulnerable areas. There is, in other words, a lawlessness to the police which is symptomatic of the lawlessness of law per se. Its power is formless, like its nowhere tangible, all-pervasive, ghostly presence in the life of civilized states. And here, he says, something rotten in the law is revealed. And that is that all violence as a means, even in the most favorable case, is implicated in the problematic nature of law itself, what we've been discussing as the arbitrariness of the legitimacy of violence in its foundation and maintenance. And this is why, for Benjamin, all law-preserving violence in its duration indirectly weakens the law-making violence it represents. This is a classic case of showing your hand. If we want states to be legitimate, they need laws. And those laws must be protected, if necessary, by violence. But every time we use violence to legitimate the state, we undermine its legitimacy, the perception of its legitimacy. This problem of law preserving violence as both preserving and undermining the state is exactly what happened in Ireland around colonialism. Every time they wanted to legitimate the state, they had to be seen to deliver at least some modicum of justice for the Irish. But every time they used violence to underpin their law, they discredited the perception of themselves as in any way interested in justice for the Irish. It was an aspect of the other problem of franchise reform that we saw as well, bearing in mind that in order for the union of England and Ireland to be seen as valid, all the rights that were given to citizens in England had to be extended to Ireland for the union to be valid. But every time they extended the rights of franchise, for example, to the Irish would use it to vote them out. Here again, whether they went with constitutional means or violent means, the colonial state was determined or doomed, kind of condemned by its own methods to undermine its own legitimacy, whether legal or illegal. So that for Benjamin, and this shows you how inelegant domination is as a tool. And this is why ideology arguably was invented. In the Marxist tradition, they would say that ideology is the thing that makes us want to obey the law so that they don't have to be violent in forcing us to obey the law. If people obey the law by consent, this whole rotten, murky area of illegitimate violence and violence has been founded in the sorry, let me say that again. This whole problem of illegitimate and legitimate violence, the founding of the state, and the idea that all violence and all law are implicated in the same murky shadow economy of violence. This whole problem goes away if you can get people to obey the law by consent, if you can manipulate them into agreeing with you. So that the invention of ideology was one way of blunting the kind of perception of law preserving violence as undermining the legitimacy of the state that it served. So that even parliaments, for Benjamin, are founded on the latent presence of violence in these legal institutions. And he suggests that most parliaments begin to decay when they forget the fact that they actually represent a lawmaking violence. That what a parliament achieves in vital affairs can be only those legal decrees that in their origin and outcome are affected by violence. If we go back to the two rivals, the cartoon that we've been using throughout this course to frame issues of colonialism and sexuality, and also Irish politics of constitutionalism and physical force traditions, you'll see that by now, the woman in the middle is being asked to choose between two alternatives. One is framed as the lawbreaker, and that's obviously the dynamiter from the Land League, the simian ape. But the other, the suitor with the land bill, is now the law preserver and the lawmaker, the maker of just laws that must be preserved from people like the dynamite herd by legal means. But at this point in Benjamin's analysis, neither is free of the threat of violence. One threatens violence in the future, and that's the land leaguer. The other's position, including his respectable top hat, are all founded in an originary act of violence that legitimates the state which now claims a monopoly on violence on his behalf. So the distinction of a choice between violence and peace is a false one. The Constitution itself is a violent act and a document of violent power. It's what Zizek calls systemic violence, the violence that underpins the normal order of things. And it's against that background, you remember, that occasional subjective outbursts of violence have to be understood. So Benjamin suggests that among all of the forms of violence permitted by both natural law and positive law, not one is free of the gravely problematic nature already indicated of all legal violence. Since, however, every conceivable solution to human problems remains impossible if violence is totally excluded in principle, the question necessarily arises as to what kinds of violence exist other than those envisaged by legal theory. And here he talks about two kinds of violence, mythic and divine. It is never reason that decides on the justification of means and the justness of ends, he suggests. Fate-imposed violence decides on the former and God on the latter. Fate-imposed violence, you remember, is linked to the contingency of circumstance and the arbitrariness of historical conditions. What God is doing here is more obscure and more difficult to understand. And the concept of divine violence is one that there is a considerable degree of controversy over in studies of Benjamin. He brings us back to Greek myth and to mythic violence, the uncertain, ambiguous sphere of fate. And he suggests that the arbitrariness of the will of the gods, which is notorious and evident to anyone who's read, for example, Tales from Ovid, is identical, he says, with all legal violence. Lest you think the gods are being merely playful or sadistic, he says all legal violence is mythic in its origins and in its fated, contingent nature. So that this notion that mythic violence is of a nature or of a character, of one character with legal violence, requires us, Benjamin says, to reject legal violence as a kind of given that commands our assent. And what he wants us to think about instead, what he calls the antithesis of mythic violence, is something called divine violence. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that one way to read revolutionary violence, and this is something that Benjamin is suggesting in his essay, is that it may be what Benjamin is trying to talk about in this category of divine violence. So let's see what he says about it. If mythic violence is lawmaking, divine violence is law destroying. If the former sets boundaries, the latter boundlessly destroys them. If mythic violence brings at once guilt and retribution, divine power only expiates. If the former threatens, the latter strikes. If the former is bloody, the latter is lethal without spilling blood. Now this, I will admit, I don't understand. How divine violence can be lethal without spilling blood. He gives an example of the annihilation of an entire people by God. And obviously in that moment he's suggesting that they weren't so much killed as annihilated. But then this sphere of violence, which seems to be the prerogative of a monotheistic and somewhat violent God, is also seen in Benjamin's essay to be the prerogative of men in certain circumstances. Mythic violence is bloody power over mere life for its own sake. Divine violence is pure power over all life for the sake of the living. The first demands sacrifice, the second accepts it. So if men are willing to accept the concept of sacrifice, divine violence becomes available to them and allows them, Benjamin suggests, to override the biblical injunction that thou shalt not kill. For one thing, he says, the injunction becomes inapplicable, incommensurable once the deed is accomplished. So Benjamin is suggesting that there are circumstances in which the biblical commandment, thou shalt not kill, does not apply. One, obviously, is self-defense. But there are others. So that he suggests that those who base a condemnation of all violent killing of one person by another on the commandment are mistaken. It exists not as a criterion of judgment, but as a guideline for the actions of persons or communities who have to wrestle with it in solitude and, in exceptional cases, to take on themselves the responsibility of ignoring it. And here is where those rebels of 1916 might plausibly be said to have participated in an act of what Benjamin is calling divine violence. to the extent that the justification for the violence can only ever be retroactive. In other words, forget about the notion of means and ends. The violence will have been justified if it achieves the goal that it sets out to achieve. Now, obviously, this is a complicated area ethically, and it's not helped by the relative obscurity of this concept of divine violence. But Benjamin singles out the revolutionary killing of an oppressor as an example of what he's talking about. If we think about this in a colonial context, where the issue of violence as legitimate or illegitimate is starkly revealed as being arbitrary and imposed anyway, the whole notion of divine violence, the whole notion of there being circumstances in which one is allowed to kill and perhaps even required to do so, becomes more easy to understand. That revolutionary violence for Benjamin, the highest manifestation of unalloyed violence by man, is possible. However, there's a problem here for us in that Benjamin sees the notion of the violent overthrow of the state as circular for obvious reasons. If the English, he suggests, he doesn't say this in the essay, but this is what his analysis would suggest in an Irish context. If the Irish rebels are going to justify the overthrow of the English state on the basis that English law is illegitimate, they are then going to merely found another state through another arbitrary act of violence, leading to another distinction between legitimate and illegitimate force, which will itself be arbitrary and founded in violence. So you're replacing one oppressor with another. So perhaps we shouldn't be calling revolutionary nationalism a form of divine violence for Walter Benjamin. He seems to be more interested, as a good Marxist, in the class struggle, the notion that divine violence is justified if it leads to the abolition of state power per se. In other words, the state in all of its forms for Benjamin is a vehicle of tyranny. And the only reason why it allows itself a monopoly on violence is because it is a self-legitimating lie that does not command and ought not to command the loyalty of the worker. Benjamin is not really interested in national sentiment because he sees it as a sop thrown to the people to force them or encourage them or cajole them into accepting their servitude to the nation. Religion is the opium of the people, Marx had said, and nationalism was another version of that same problem. So, if mythic violence obliges us to reject the legal basis for violence, Benjamin seems to be suggesting that there are situations in which violence is justified. And one of those, I'm suggesting, might be, and in my view, you get into the semantics of law and order versus terrorism. These are differences of opinion or definitions or constructions of violence that are at play anywhere that we have the nation state. So this is super relevant even today. Obviously, not just in relation to the extraordinary acts of the American police force in relation to racialized subjects, but here in Canada or anywhere that there's a police force, anywhere that there's a standing army, anywhere that there's a border, and anywhere that there's a colonial occupation. So the question then in the Irish case becomes, are the Irish people obliged to accept illegitimate colonial occupation, or are they permitted to pursue violence as one means of overthrowing the colonial oppressor? And that was the question that the Irish political scene kind of talked around for centuries. In the Two Rivals cartoon, it's very clear that the English wanted to show the Irish as simian apes, backward people, given to violence in a kind of natural state. They're exactly the kind of thing that Hobbes is telling us that a sovereign monopoly on violence gets us away from. That Englishness has at least solved the problem of power to the extent that they've gotten it under control. But are the Irish obliged to accept that narrative? And if not, are they entitled to violence as a means to the end of overthrowing English colonial power? You can see how there is no easy answer to this, and at a certain point, people have to, and this is what Benjamin says they have to, people have to decide for themselves. They have to take stock of their actions. They have to wrestle in solitude and, in exceptional cases, take on themselves the responsibility of ignoring the commandment, thou shalt not kill. When we looked at the Fenians during the land war, the people that in those cartoons were being represented as ape-like, you noticed an extraordinary pragmatism in their pronouncements. That when constitutionalism worked, they felt justified in using the Constitution. When the gun seemed like it might be more effective, they turned to the gun. They felt that their position was legitimated by the illegitimacy of the colonial occupiers' force and their monopoly on violence. Yeats, in plays like Kathleen Ní Houliháin, seemed to agree. But then in the play On Bayou Strand, we saw him change his mind. He came up with a much more complicated allegory about legitimate violence and illegitimate violence. And Concobar in that play is trying to bid Cuchulainn to come back into the fold and calm down so that they might leave a settled country to their children. The problem of violence and its control is at the heart of Yeats's work at this time because it's at the heart of the Irish political and historical process. And anywhere that colonialism is ongoing, you can expect this issue to be front and center. That there'll be a colonial occupying force seeking at all times to legitimate itself, and an occupied people seeking at all times to overthrow them and to legitimate their own appeal to violence to that end.